and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to quality in the early years and school age sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Arachas Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.arachas.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. In this series of the podcast, we're looking at some aspects of policy and research. And in this episode, we're going to explore a little bit more around the idea of the educator as a researcher. Action or practitioner research is something that we might do every day, and sometimes we're not particularly aware of it, and it's maybe not written up as research. And this is the topic that we started to look at in our recent webinar with Professor Kate Wall and Sharon Skehill, and also in some recent blogs. And today we're going to explore some more of those ideas and concepts. So my guests for this episode to tease out some of these thoughts around the idea of the educator as a researcher are Dr. Leah O'Toole and Sylwia O'Rourke. Leah is the Assistant Professor in Early Childhood Education in the Froebel Department of the Primary and Early Childhood Education degree in Maynooth. She's the Programme Coordinator of the BA in Early Childhood Teaching and Learning, a Level 8 degree delivered in partnership with us in Early Childhood Ireland. And Sylwia is an early years tutor and a graduate of that BA in Early Childhood Teaching and Learning. So Sylwia and Leah, you're both really welcome. Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Moira.
Thank you very much for having us.
Okay, Leah, we might start with you to talk a little bit about what action research is, how it differs from other, maybe, what might be perceived as more traditional or common forms of research, and why it suits the early education field so well, why it's, the idea of action research fits what we do in early childhood well.
Yeah, sure. So action research is very much focused on practice. And you mentioned there a minute ago that I'm the Programme Coordinator of the degree in Early Childhood Teaching and Learning, the Level 8 degree in the Froebel Department. And, all of the programmes really in the Froebel Department are very much focused on practice. So our own one, the primary teaching degrees, the master's degrees. And so a decision was kind of made a good while ago now to really focus in on action research, because Sylwia can speak to this a bit in terms of her experience, but very often when people are doing dissertations and doing research, they're lovely pieces of work, but they get put on a shelf then, and that's the end of them, whereas the area of action research is really focused on improving practice and supporting educators to really live to their values. So, for example, I was chatting to a student that I was supervising there recently, and she was saying to me that after her action research project, it just changed everything. It changed everything she did. It changed her thinking, her understanding of her own values. It changed her practice completely, so that even though now the thesis is over and done with and is on the shelf, that legacy is still there, that she's changing her work as she goes. So I think that's what's so really interesting about action research, that it's practical, it's about being useful. What I also find really interesting about it is that it's kind of changing our views on who we consider to be an expert. So who has the knowledge that is relevant for education. I've been doing a good bit of work recently myself in the area of participant action research. So that's the idea of university academics and practicing early childhood educators or primary teachers working together to develop new knowledge and to improve practice. So, traditionally you asked me about what's the difference between it and traditional research. And I suppose traditionally, so-called experts would come into an educational setting with a set idea in mind, imposed on educators, on children, on parents, what they felt was best, maybe measured outcomes, and that was considered research. Whereas this approach is more about recognizing the expertise that educators have, the children have in terms of their own lives, the parents have, and kind of co-creating that knowledge together. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does. And I suppose I remember hearing at one of the Early Childhood Ireland research symposiums, and it was something that kind of stuck in my head. And I remember even tweeting about it at the time, that you mentioned about that idea that educators don't always see themselves as researchers, but that some of the common skills between the field of action research and early education are observation, attunement, and interest. And observation and attunement in particular, they're not skills that you use massively maybe in the more traditional forms of quantitative research, but I really liked that idea that it can kind of help people see that it's something they're doing unconsciously. You see a child doing something, you notice what they're kind of tuned into, what their interests are. You wonder if you do X, Y, or Z. You read a little bit about it, you tweak something in your environment. Maybe the bit that's missing is that it's not kind of maybe formalized or written up, but it really is having an impact on practice on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important point, Moira. And, you mentioned Kate Wall and her work, and she's really leading the way in that idea that, as educators, very often people don't have a self-identity as a researcher, but that actually good pedagogy is good data collection, so all those skills that people have, as you say, around attunement, around kind of really tuning into what's happening from a child's perspective, all the ways they document children's learning, those are really, really good data collection methods, particularly with babies, toddlers, and young children. So to give you an example, one of the pieces of research that I'm absolutely immersed in at the moment, that's really taken up all my time, is a piece of work that's been funded by the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. And as people may be aware, they're working on at the moment on improving and developing ASHTR. So in Maynooth, in the Froebel department, in partnership with yourselves and Early Childhood Ireland and with colleagues up in Stranmillis University College, we won the tender to consult with babies, toddlers, and young children about their experiences of ASHTR. And it was really interesting because very often people hear consult on babies and think, how is this actually going to happen? But actually, the way we structured it is drawing on that expertise that really immersed, attuned educators have in working with babies. I mean, your listeners know babies can communicate in so many different ways, be that behaviorally, facial expressions, how they move, how they, there's so many ways that babies will communicate their thoughts and their interests and their ideas. We structured this piece of research in terms of participant action research, where we have practicing educators who know these babies, these toddlers, these children so well that they can, and they're very expert educators in terms of their documentation, so they can really give a really good picture of the children's lives and their experiences and how ASHTR might be experienced by them. And Sylwia is one of the educators who's been working with us on that.
Thanks, Leah. Yes, and Sylwia, I'm dying to hear from you and your experience recently of using it. When I did my master's dissertation, it was action research around children's emotional development. It's a little while since I did it in a formal sense, so really looking forward to hearing about your recent experiences.
So I suppose I have a few points to pick up on between yourself, Maura, and Leah. You've mentioned a few bits. So first of all, the context part of it. So I think it's extremely important that we understand now that the researchers coming into settings who are kind of removed from the children, don't have relationships with them. I think there was an article released recently about researchers in white coats and how we're moving away from that. that. So Leah also mentioned it's really the educators who are experts on the way children behave, on the way the children communicate, but also kind of wide relationships come into that. So they know about children's families, they know the context. They might realize that in the morning something might have happened, and that will affect the child's interaction for the day, but also long term. They know where children come from, so they know the roots. They know there might have been an issue beforehand, or children might have struggled with something, and that will all affect the way kind of they perform as such for the research. So it's just the context bit of it is huge, but also Leah talked about how educators do kind of a lot of the research. They have a lot of the research skills without even realizing it. And initially, when I was preparing for this podcast, I thought, well, do you know what? I hate this idea of, oh, sure, they're doing it anyway. Because I always think that it's kind of the meaning, the kind of value of what we do as such. So it's not that we're doing it anyway, it's that we have certain skills and we have wonderful foundations, but it's also hugely important to be aware of that. And I suppose reflective practice has been a part of early childhood education in settings for a long time now. Some settings have time kind of away from the children to do it, others don't, but nonetheless everybody does it, whether it's kind of quietly in the evening going over what happened during the day, or whether it's kind of intentionally at meetings with other staff members. And this action and research is really just building on that. So we have the data collection from quality centres have a huge amount of quality data, which is contextual. But another thing, I suppose, it's also kind of a little unpredictable and messy. And working with children, the nature of that is the same. And action research is just so compatible with that. The two go hand in hand extremely well that way. It's kind of organic. And what I love about it is it changes the way we look at education. So there is this kind of rigid idea of education as the teacher who is the kind of transmitter of knowledge, if you like, and children are these passive receivers. Whereas through action research, we see this wonderful inquiry that is kind of collective, and it's a collaboration between teachers and children. And I see that kind of not only, it's nearly like restructuring the whole idea of education from the bottom up, because sometimes what I find now, I can compare from my work with children to the work that I do with adults now. And I received a piece of advice when I started tutoring adults, and it was, they just like you to tell them what to write. And my heart broke at that, because I thought, I want them to find out. I don't want to be telling them anything. And I think it's a very sad reflection on how somewhere along the educational journey, people get stuck with this, well, there's one way of doing it, and you have to learn this way. Whereas what I would love is for early years to lead the way into the inquiry, into the collaborative inquiry, so that people, kind of young children, grow up into human beings who question things and who want to learn and who want to find out about things.
I think that, that bit about children questioning, it's bringing their voice into it, like Leah mentioned earlier on. That's so important. And as I mentioned, children and, and talking about kind of different forms of research and how, the educators know the children. Sylwia, you made that point as well, that children respond to people who are familiar to them in a different way to when they're strangers, in inverted commas, in a room. So that kind of brings me, I suppose, to the area of ethics and that bit about ethics is a vital part of any quality research, any research that's carried out in any kind of an unethical way is completely unacceptable, and nor can the findings be relied on anyway. So Leah first maybe, and then Sylwia, if you've something to say on the ethical aspect of practitioner research.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is crucial, and it's something that's been taking up a lot of space in my mind over the last little while, because traditional research and traditional ethics systems kind of grew in, it grew together. And I think with practitioner research and with the more creative approaches we're using in action research, we actually need to start revisiting what we mean by ethical practice. To give an example of one of the things that I've been trying to work through in my own mind lately is where protection actually becomes silencing. So, for example, if you go to an ethics committee and say you want to do work with babies and toddlers, they're horrified, because they think, oh gosh, how are we going to get to protect these babies and these toddlers and these young children? And to the extent that, now I'm not referring to Maynooth here, I'm talking about kind of generally speaking, ethics committees tend to have a kind of a fear of engaging with this cohort. And interestingly, I was presenting at the NCCA Research Day recently with another colleague from the University of Limerick, and he was talking about how the same kind of dynamics exist with groups of people who were traditionally seen as hard to reach. This was the terminology that was put in it. And he was asking the question, well, are they hard to reach, or are we? And I'd kind of say the same about ethics for babies, toddlers, and young children. So, I mean, since the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, we know that young children are entitled and able to give their opinions and to show the world how it is from their perspective. So we really need to be thinking beyond, for example, just looking for parental consent, and think about how we engage with very young children to gauge whether they consent or assent to take part in a piece of research. I know Lavisa Sconefers has done some really lovely work on that, around the idea of an ethical radar. And I love that phrase, because it's like you're constantly beep, 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 on the lookout for opportunities to really understand how this baby or toddler or young child is experiencing this. And it's back to your point, Moira, again about attunement. So those who work with young children know that they can very clearly tell you if they are not happy with something. They can very clearly indicate if they're delighted with something, And I think the kind of the linearity of consent as well is different with small children. So, for example, with an adult, we're expected to say in advance, here's what I'm going to do, and do you consent or do you not? Whereas if you're engaging with, let's say, an arts-based activity with a small child, and you say, do you want to take part? They might initially say no, but then wander over, start to pick up materials, start to engage, so that do we respond to that initial no, or are we attuned enough to see, well, actually, no, this child is telling me they do want to take part. And as Sylwia said, like, action research is such a journey. It can be very messy. It can go in directions that you might not have predicted beforehand. So I think we need to work with the ethics committees and with kind of our understanding of ethics, that in traditional research, you can kind of say in advance, here's what I'm going to do. Do you consent to it or do you not? And be very clear about that. Whereas I think ethics for action research and with very young children needs to be more an iterative, attuned process. You don't kind of agree in advance and then forget about it. It's something that is kind of instilled into every decision that's made. And, in the moment, you're constantly attuned to the idea of kind of ethical dilemmas, that there may not be a right answer here, but it's about constantly using that ethical radar to take us in the right direction. It's complex.
It is. And using your example of the arts activity, equally, there's the bit that if a child says yes and then drops the paintbrush and walk away,
that has to be respected. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that whole area of informed consent that we talk about so much with adults is, in many ways, how can you say yes to something that you don't know what it entails? So you have to have that right to engage or disengage as you know more about it, because for some people, if you're unsure about something or anxious or uncertain, your default can be no. And then when you understand more about it, you kind of say, oops, this might be something I'd like, even as an adult.
Oh, this is it. And, particularly where, we'll probably talk a bit about data collection, but increasingly the kinds of ways we collect data are the kind of activities that are happening in early childhood settings anyway. So let's use the arts-based example. And, we get ethical dilemmas like, what if a parent has said no, they don't want their child to take part in the research, but then this lovely activity is happening in the setting and the child does want to take part, and there's the ethics of exclusion and inclusion, and it's not straightforward. I mean, the conclusion that we've come to in our research is that in those activities children are allowed to take part, but none of the data is used then if we don't have parental consent. So that's how we kind of try to balance that one. But I mean, in going back to what Sylwia said as well, like, I think there's the ethical piece, the methodological piece is so interesting for action research, because ethically speaking, we are able to ask questions now that maybe weren't ever asked before in traditional research approaches. So if it's the case that you're using a research approach that you have to be able to measure something, you have to have a hypothesis. So in other words, what do I think is going to happen here? You have to be able to measure it before and afterwards. And it all has to be very numerical and very kind of objective. Then there are certain questions we're not going to ask. So things like, for example, what does this relationship mean? How can I improve the relationships between me and the children in the setting? Like, how do you measure a relationship numerically? So I think those kind of questions, or for example, for decades, the kind of research that was done on children's behavior was with a mindset to management. So I measure what I've decided are bad behaviors beforehand. I do an intervention, and then I measure again what I've decided are bad behaviors afterwards, and I see the outcome. And it was only when we started to ask, well, why might children be protesting their contexts? How is behavior communicating something to me? Those bigger, deeper questions. And I think action research is ethically and methodologically much better placed to answer those questions.
Sylwia, do you want to come in on the area of ethics?
Absolutely. So I think when we speak again, the terminology of action research, so Leah mentioned methodologies and kind of ethical considerations. I think the reason educators don't see themselves as researchers is it kind of sounds a little bit daunting. But when you break it down, I think ethics is so well interwoven into the fabric of early childhood settings for such a long time now. So kind of ethical decisions face educators every single day, multiple times, because we're dealing with parents, and it's kind of, some people, you have to have different approaches to different people. Basically, we're dealing with different children every year. Practically, there's a different group of children. If you consider, say, the free preschool year, even our practice for a long time was that educators move every year from classroom to classroom. We've kind of now changed that to staying for a little bit longer from the relationship point of view, but it was practiced for many, many years. And just to kind of learn to deal with a specific different group of children, I, for example, found, so I have two examples to share. So one of them was our documentation changed. So the 14 years of me working in the community centre, our documentation kind of strategies changed about 5 or 6 times. So we adopted strategies, then we tweaked them because somebody found they didn't work as well. And we kept kind of repeating that cycle and trialing it out, and then discussing it again, and then something else didn't work, so we tweak it again. And it's pretty much a definition of action research, what happened there. But one of the examples was that I had a group of boys when I was working in the preschool room, full day care. And at the time, the kind of choice of documentation was that we would do journals with children. So we were dead set on approaching the children and kind of choosing photographs and sticking them in with us and discussing them. And this was lovely and insightful, and it worked for many children. But the group of boys that I had would never choose by themselves to sit at the journal and do that. So my job, I felt, was to kind of redesign this documentation process for them. And I spent a lot of time talking to my colleagues about what examples, but I never consulted them as such. It was only after a little while that it struck me, well, I'm just going to ask them what way would they like to document their memories. And we had long conversations about it, and I documented the conversations, and then we talked about the conversations, and like that they kept changing their minds. So one day we did something and another day we did something else. Sometimes they wanted photographs of what they've created outside, but they didn't necessarily want to stick them into their journals. Maybe they just wanted to bring them home. Other times, drawing was another kind of art-based method that we used to kind of help children express their feelings and kind of reinforce the memories about things, I suppose, and help them, the kind of metacognition piece, understand their own learning. But again, these boys were not in any way interested in drawing, so we kind of made sculptures outside. Maybe it was still kind of an art approach as such, but just different methodologies. So this was a very good example of how ethics work there. So we just communicated with each other, and changing minds was okay. It wasn't an issue that they consented to something at the start and then they want to change their mind again. And I just found I'm still so fond of that group of boys, and we were so attuned to each other's needs and to each other's feelings, and even relationships with parents were better because of that, and stronger, because there was so many conversations back and forth about what we did today and yesterday. And so I think ethics is just something that, again, kind of happens unofficially in childcare centres. So we have to make these tough decisions so many times. And again, we have regulations, we have rules, we have Ashton and Shilta to guide us, we have TUSLA. And all these agencies have these strict rules, but children don't always go by these strict rules. So every day we're faced with making decisions on the spot that will have the best interest of children at heart. So I think ethics is definitely coming in very strongly into this.
I think you make a really good point that the ethical practice is there, and that maybe it's, maybe naming it more, making it more visible, to show that we're making these considerations, because there's no doubt that anybody who is interested in the best interests of children will do that in an ethical way and involve them. So just as we start to wrap up, I remember Jean McNiff, who's written extensively on the whole area of action research, remember her saying that teachers need to have a say in what counts as policy, and that they need to have confidence in themselves as creators of new theory, so that others will develop confidence in their capacity. For me, that's a very important part of action research, that idea that, and you even touched on it a minute ago, Sylwia, that, that we have Shilta and we've Ashton and we've TUSLA and we've all these regulations that sometimes, we might sometimes feel are being done to us rather than with us. So do either of you have something to add on that bit of the importance of action research as giving educators a voice in the creation of theory and policy?
So I certainly would like to say that there's this kind of idea. I was trying to read a little bit about it, and there was the idea that practitioner action research is kind of seen as more informal and sort of, okay, well, you do it with your group of children, but sure, it's not transferable really, so it's no good for anything. But I actually think quite the opposite. So what my idea is that to me, the kind of concept of introducing general theory for all children is just crazy, because children are so different. Every individual child has their own needs. They're all different ages. They're all different capabilities, different dispositions. So it's very difficult to understand how can you produce a piece of research that is supposed to tackle all the children. So to me, educators who work with small groups of children kind of produce the most accurate data for that particular group as such. And of course, some of it can be transferable. We have similarities as human beings as well as differences. But just kind of the idea of the most accurate, relevant research for us is the one that we do with our groups of children. And there's nothing to say that there is the research centre in DCU now where we kind of get more formal research done, I suppose, as such. But there's nothing to stop us thinking that the individual educator research could be incorporated into that. And if it was gathered, that patterns might occur out of it. So I think the data that educators collect daily is very viable and very valuable, and it should be considered. And it should be relevant and kind of added to the general pool of research.
Leah, do you want to add something to
absolutely.
that about its transferability and impact on policy?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that strike me there in listening to both of you. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is the experiences that have been reported back to me from our student educators who use action research in their practice. Because like a lot of, particularly on our flexible degree, a lot of people are doing that degree having maybe done level 5, level 6, having spent a lot of time in the early education sector, but not necessarily in third level academic institutions. And what they have said is that doing this action research for their dissertation really gives them the language and the confidence to defend their practice. So for example, if an inspector comes in and asks a question about why a certain approach is being used, that they now feel, they always knew why they were doing it, but that they now feel, having done this research, well, I now know how to explain this in terms that the higher powers will understand and respond to. So it's that confidence piece, back to what we were saying about identity, But drawing on what Sylwia was saying there about kind of the different types of research that are valued, I suppose, in terms of policy, I don't think we should underestimate how much policymakers are willing actually to listen to the results of this type of research. So for example, as I mentioned already, engaging with the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, they were at their ethics day recently, their research day recently, they were really interested in hearing, how can we genuinely consult with educational sectors? Like, rather than kind of putting up a questionnaire on the NCCA website, they genuinely want to know, how can we hear the voices of educators? How can we hear the voices of children, of parents, of those who are experiencing the educational system? And action research is one way in which they do, So I think we can worry sometimes about whether action research will be perceived as rigorous. And certainly we need to, because we need to ensure that our approaches are rigorous, although rigor measured perhaps in a different way than traditionally. But I think we're pushing an open door there when it comes to policymakers. They want to hear this stuff.
Sometimes we hold ourselves back with our confidence that we kind of say, well, I haven't done a degree, or I don't know. Yeah. So I suppose just a couple of words to wrap up. How would each of you suggest that people would kind of maybe get started with using action research in settings? Sylwia? Sylwia, I might start with you.
Absolutely. So I think we've mentioned already that I think action research is just kind of an extended way of reflecting. So just to make sure that the emphasis is on the action bit, so that we reflect on something and then we put an action in place and just reflect the reflective cycle back again. So again, what Leah said, we also need to understand a little bit about the technicality of it to be able to articulate ourselves. So many educators attend degree courses now, and certainly part of Maynooth University's dissertation, as Leah mentioned, is action research, so they can be introduced to it that way. But also, so to give an example of our centre, the educators who have experienced action research have passed on the benefits of it to the rest of our team. And now the whole team within the centre is engaged in some sort of an action research action as such. So I think it will spread, and hopefully we will be able to contribute to the overall body of research that way.
And Leah? I
Yeah,
really liked that idea, Sylwia, of an extended way of reflecting and linking that, Leah, with the pedagogical documentation that settings already have, that, that there's a lot of it done already, but maybe not called action research. So it's, what would the next step be to maybe
yeah.
formalizing that a little bit more for you,
That's it.
Leah?
I mean, like there's a few things again that come to mind. I mean, what Sylvia has said there about leadership really is what you're talking about, Sylvia, there, that, people have come back into their settings with these experiences. So they can be really transformative in that way, that, that can spread it throughout a setting, that more sort of systematic approach to reflection and to engagement with that kind of thing. I mean, on the other hand, I'm coming at this hands in the air, probably a little bit biased in that I'm so proud of the degree that we deliver in Maynooth, and I think that I really would recommend to anybody who's considering it to take that next step, even if it's not with ourselves, with any of the institutions, to take that next step to level 8 study, to level 9 study, on to doctorate level. Because really, back to your previous question about policy, it's when I'm struggling to try to express this, but I mean, for example, we had our last lecture with our third years recently, graduating out of the degree, and it really was so moving to hear about how they really felt that now they had the language for this, and that previously they felt they had skills, they had ideas, they had really good practice, but they just didn't know how to express it in a way that people would listen to. So that's what the degree gives you. It's not just the level 8 piece of paper. It's that confidence and that language and that that ability to communicate why you're doing what you're doing and how you're doing it.
And that
So
there's skills you bring with you, because I think, kind of going back to the start, that idea that you do your dissertation, it sits on the shelf, and it's lovely to look at that green or red bound book with the gold writing, but that was a part of your life that's gone. I think the key bit is that when you go to the effort and time and expense of doing a degree, that you have the skills that you bring with you that enhance your working life and the daily lives of the children and families that you're working with.
100%, Moira, definitely. And I mean, that applies even to kind of going forward for a degree, like rather than even just a dissertation piece, because people can be intimidated by third level institutions and universities. And I think a lot of educators really underestimate the level of skill that they have, that they bring with them. That really are transferable. Like, good pedagogy is good research.
So that's a good point to end. It's been a really good discussion. Thank you both so much for sharing your expertise. And, I think with the expertise and experience and, the talk of the rigor and the ethics, I hope that the idea of action research is, very much becoming more mainstream than it was. So thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to us today. And thanks for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Arachas Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.